right. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's 30 Minutes Wednesday webinar. My name is Mike Stratton. I am a systems engineer with Verify, and I am your host. I am joined today by Victor Verba. He's not just a systems engineer, he is the systems engineer with Verify. He'll be demonstrating some of the common Cube report requests that we've seen since the release of our Cube reporting feature, and he'll explain some of the important field definitions. Today, going over our agenda, we're going to start off with an overview of our company and what we do. Then we'll jump right into a live demo. Vic will demonstrate some of the common Cube reports, and then we'll pause for some Q&A. If you have any questions during the demonstration, please type them into the Q&A chat window that should be in the bottom right corner of your screen. And then after that, we will have after Q&A, we'll go ahead and reward one lucky attendee with a $50 Amazon gift card. So make sure you stay until the end to see if you've won. Quick overview of Verify. We are the preferred analytics and management solution for Cisco collaboration. We provide industry-leading CDR reporting, call analytics, customizable dashboards, UCCX, real-time wallboard reporting, and analytics, remote phone control, macros and broadcast, change management, ASP reporting, DN and dial plan management, and now we also offer Cisco Cube CDR reporting. Before we get started, Verify now offers Ninja Enhanced Consulting Services, or NECS. What is NECS? Well, it's when one of our system engineers, like Vic or myself, will engage remotely on a one-on-one basis to provide additional consulting services. It can be anything from reporting, dashboard configurations, to system monitoring. This provides a dedicated SE to you. We will do all the heavy lifting. If someone needs a report, they can contact us and we'll create the report for them. If you want any additional information, please let one of us know or speak with your account manager, and we would be more than happy to go over our consulting services more in depth. With all that said, I want to thank you for attending today's webinar, and I'm going to pass the ball to Victor.
Right. Thank you, Mike, for that extremely complimentary introduction.
You are welcome.
All right. Hello, everybody, and thank you guys for joining us today. As Mike said, my name is Victor Verba, and I'm an engineer over here at Verify. What we're going to go ahead and dig a little bit into today is our Cube Analytics. So one of the things we're going to just start off with briefly is, well, why do we need Cube Analytics? So, just to kind of touch on it, the thing about Cube is it is front-ending a lot of your call flows. So calls may come directly from PSTNs or other SIP gateways. They may go into your call manager. They may not hit your call manager at all. They could potentially go into a CCE network, or they can go off to an Office 365 or an MS Teams network. The Cube may control how calls flow from one PSTN over to a secondary PSTN. So having that Cube analytic really kind of gives you the front end visibility to all of those call flows, because that voice gateway is going to be determining how those calls get routed based off of your peer IDs and the routing configurations that you have in your Cube. So taking a look at the diagram that I have on my screen here, this is just a very simple Cube type diagram where I have a PSTN. Calls can go from my PSTN, maybe off to my Chicago cluster at the top right. My Chicago cluster can route calls through the Cube and back out to the PSTN. So there's a lot of different things that voice gateway is going to control. So having that visibility is really going to kind of give you the overall infrastructure of how those calls are flowing, not just flowing from the call manager perspective, as in, who's answering the calls, what departments are answering the calls, how's capacity at my call manager. That's all great information, absolutely necessary. But part of what you could potentially be missing, depending on your environment, is what happens to those calls that don't even hit the call manager. That's what we're going to take a look at today. So we'll go ahead and pop back and forth to this diagram because we'll use some of these IP addresses as we're starting to run some reports. So first thing I'm looking at here is a Cube dashboard. We're monitoring capacity utilization. We could do this at individual route levels. I can look at capacity from calls flowing over to my CCE. In this case, I'm looking at my AT&T rollover, and I'm looking at my capacity utilization at my AT&T rollover. So how am I doing that? How, from a Cube perspective, am I isolating just the calls that are going to my AT&T rollover line? So one of the fields that we're going to focus in on, and one of the common fields that we find reporting on, is going to be what's called the remote media address. So I'm going to show you that in a second here. So when I edit this configuration for this dashboard right here, you're going to notice my search set, remote media address. Remote media address is going to be the IP address that the calls are routing to and from. So that's a very important field when you're doing your routing to try to figure out where calls are routing to, where they're coming from, and things like that. So a very important value and a very important field we're going to see in some of our reporting. Some of the other common things we can do is, you know what, these calls don't make it into the call manager. I have calls that, you know, people are calling and saying, hey, I got dropped. I didn't talk to anybody. You're not seeing those calls in your call manager. Well, they may not be coming out of your voice gateway. So they may not be coming out of the cube. So being able to look at things like termination codes or internal errors are also things that are going to be very important for your cube analytics. So let's jump into some of the reporting aspects. So right here, I have one of my cube systems set up. And if you're familiar with Verify, you're going to know capital X's are wildcards. So I'm just going to do a very blanket search for the current day. And I'm going to look at basically all my calls. Just about every call is going to have a calling number. Calling number is your caller ID. Now you're going to see on my screen, I have quite a few fields out here. Setup time, connect time, disconnect time, call duration, kind of common fields. Most of the time, you're predominantly looking at your setup time. But I wanted to add these guys in here to talk a little bit about how cube data is sorted. So what we do from a cube perspective is cube has events. It has a answer event and it has an originate event. Those are the two most common events. And you're going to notice that right here under my H323 call origin. That's another extremely important field to look at when you're reporting on cube data. So you'll notice on the left-hand side, I use this drop-down. So this is a singular call. Every call that's going in or out of cube is going to have multiple events. It's going to have the event where the call comes into the cube, but it's also going to have a call or an event when it leaves the cube or terminates. All right. A call could have lots of different events, all in the same sequence of events. So what I'm looking at here is a single call that had two events. The answer event under my H323 call origin is, I always like to say to it, is that is the cube answering the call. That is the first point that that call is hitting. My originate event is where the call is going out. So in my case, looking at the remote media address, I could see that this call came in from 14.113.93.22. Now, what is that IP address? Let's go ahead and take a look. 14.113 in my case is anything coming from my Chicago cluster. So in this case, I see a call originated from my Chicago cluster and went back out this gateway here, which is 22.194.44.420. So if I take a look at my diagram here, 22.194, I can see my 22 are my PSTN. So this is actually a really good example of a call that is originating in my Chicago cluster, going through my cube, and then my dial peers and my dial plans within my cube are routing that call back out of the PSTN. So a couple very important fields right there. One, the call origin to help you determine how these calls are routing. Answer being that's the call coming into the cube. Originate being that is the call leg or event sending the call back out of the cube. The remote media address here is where the call is coming from, and then where the call is going to. So those are two very important fields here. So let's pop back over to these guys right here. So like I said in the beginning, setup time is usually the most common thing that people have within their reporting platform when they're looking at any detail. But the reason that I included the other times are because when we sort these events, we look at first the setup time. All right. Then from the setup time, we look at the connect time. And then from the connect time, we look at the disconnect time. Now, we don't have it in here yet, but it is something that we will be adding, and that's the ability to also see the milliseconds. Because you may be looking at these going, well, these are exactly the same. Well, how do you know how to sort it? Well, there's actually milliseconds tagged onto this call, and we're looking at the milliseconds. So that is something in a future release we will be adding to the cube reportability, so you can actually see down to the millisecond level the order in which these calls came in. But I just wanted to kind of add those fields in there so you can see and get an idea of, from a sorting perspective, how do we know what event came first? So I'm going to remove those guys, and we're going to take a look at some of the other fields that are important from a cube reporting perspective. So we have our setup time. That is the time the call was set up. The connect time was the call it got connected, and the disconnect time is the end of the call. Those two fields really compile the duration of the call. We have the H323 call origin. This helps us determine the flow of the call. In other words, answer leg is the call coming into the cube. originate leg is the call going back out of the cube. We also have our peer IDs. Peer IDs are actually a very useful thing from a reporting. Your peer IDs are going to help you navigate how those calls are flowing, and they're also extremely important when you're trying to troubleshoot calls, which is what we're going to take a look at in a second. So we're also going to be able to report those peer IDs. We can derive summary reports based off of all your peer IDs to see how they're being used, how often each of the individual peer IDs are being used, and that's going to directly relate to how those calls are routing through your phone system. The next thing we have here is the CLID, caller ID. So you'll notice right here what I'm searching is the calling number. That is the CLID or the caller ID. The next one that we have over here that is also extremely important is the DNIS. That is the dialed number. Now, this is probably not the best example because some of this data has been manipulated and masked. But we can see down here I have a call that came in. Let me expand this guy and see. Maybe not the best example. I know I'll have some good examples down here. And here I have a call that came in, the caller ID 636-681-1234, and it is going back out to 360-491-1234. And you'll see the same thing from an answer perspective. Here's the call coming in. And then here's the call going back out. Now, this is actually a pretty good example because we actually see that this call actually never made it. It's a zero duration call, so it was disconnected. And it was also disconnected intentionally. We see the normal call clearing disconnect text, which means it's just somebody disconnecting the line. So the caller ID is the CLID. DNIS is the number being dialed. And again, with our application, you know, if you don't know, you can't change the names of any of these fields. So one of the things that's pretty common for people to ask us is, well, why does it say H323? I'm using SIP gateways. That's just the Cisco terminology that comes over from the voice gateway. So you can change the names of any of these fields using our custom labels. The next field we're going to take a look at, which is a common detail reporting field, is going to be the voice feature. So in this case, we have two-way call, but calls could be put on hold, they could be transferred, they could be forward, they could be rerouted. Those are all things that you may want to point out or build specific reports on. So that voice feature is pretty important. And just to kind of give you an example of some of the features here, the feature sets that can be managed within the cube, you could see things like, you know, your standard two-way call. The call coming in, call going back out, standard voice, but you also have resume legs or resume events, consultative transfer events, call forward, no answer events. These are all things that could take place in the cube that could cause a call to go from 1 or 2 events in a single call to 3 or 4 or 5. Say, for example, a call comes in into my Cisco voice gateway and it's redirected back out to my call manager. I get a call forward, no answer. It may route in that same sequence of events back into call manager. In a case like that, I may get a voice feature of call forward, no answer, indicating why this leg is coming back into the cube. So there's a lot of reportability into that voice feature, but also the ability to be able to say, you know, from a cube perspective or a call event perspective, why am I seeing so many events take place for a single call? So there's a lot of different configurations that can go into that cube or that voice gateway to how it handles calls for different things like no answer, busies, even consultative transfers and things like that that route back through the cube. So that voice gateway feature here and the ability to filter on this is a great way to be able to narrow down certain events that are taking place that you may want to pinpoint. Next one over here is going to be our disconnect text. If you're familiar with call data or CDR data, think of this as our cause code. This is the reason calls are terminating. And if you noticed over here, one of the widgets that I had built right off of the bat, and this is something that I love to do with both call analytics from a CDR perspective, but as well as cube analytics, is the ability to see why those calls are terminating in my cube. Now, keep in mind, everything that we're looking at is at the cube level. So these are calls that are not making it into my MS Teams part of the network or to my UCCE network. These are calls that may be terminating in my cube before making it over to their endpoints. So that disconnect text is a great troubleshooting field, and we're going to dig a little bit more into that in a second to kind of show you how you can build a report on that and filter on just the reasons that those calls are terminating, besides kind of the normal call clearing and the standard reasons. The next field that we're going to look at over here from a call termination perspective is our internal error code message. Now, this is an important field because an internal error code means that you've received an error within your Cisco Cube or your voice gateway that's going to give you a little bit more information as to why a call ended. Now, these error codes are a combination of feature IDs. So there's no set deciphering of these. So we'll take a look at that in a second as well. As once you do have an internal error code, the best option is to just go ahead and Google it and try to get a little bit more information as to what that particular error code means, and we'll filter on those in a second as well. So the next field I have over here is our H323 conference ID. Now, this is probably not a field that you normally have in your detail, but I wanted to bring it to everyone's attention. This field is what allows us to tie all of the events of a call together. Now, remember when I said, right now we're looking at some pretty basic calls where, it's just two events. It's got an answer event, in other words, coming into the cube, and it's got an outgoing event. But once you get into some of those other voice features like call transfers, call forwards, consultative holds, user busy, you're going to get multiple events. We utilize that H323 conference ID to tie all those events together. So that's kind of our key to be able to put all of those events into a single scenario. I've seen cube calls with 40, 50 plus events in a single call flow, using different peer IDs and different routing patterns to determine how those calls are navigating around. The next guy we're going to go ahead and take a look over here is our codec type rate. The reason I added this, and this may not be a standard report, this is a standard field that you have in your reports unless you're specifically doing troubleshooting. So when you're doing troubleshooting of calls, specifically around internal error codes and things like that, that codec is important because that codec is actually described or identified in your peer IDs. Something that we see relatively common are calls being dropped or terminating prematurely because codecs it's hitting codecs that are not properly created in the peer ID. So when you're doing troubleshooting, understanding that the codec that the peer ID is routing to and maybe where you have the error message is a great way to be able to troubleshoot backwards why a call may be in particular may be dropping. If I see a lot of internal error codes and it's all pointing to the same peer ID with the same codec, gives me a reason to go back and look at that peer ID and see how it's configured and what codecs it's using. Next two fields I'm going to go ahead and mention here. Not something that you normally have in your detailed report if you're just doing general reporting, but it's a great piece of information to have. So you're going to see calling number received before translation, called number received before translation, and final translation received number. So these are great numbers to be able to see how those calls are coming in. So let's say, for example, I have an 800 number. I want to know how many people are dialing my 800 number. Well, that 800 number, once it comes in, it translates into something else. It may be a route point. It may just be a different translation pattern that you have that it translates to in the cube or in your Cisco side. Being able to look at the called number received pre-translation is a great way to be able to say, hey, I just want to report on all my 800 numbers because what we're going to see here is the 800 number as it was received prior to any translations taking place that your cube may be doing. All right. So those are kind of the top 10 or so fields that we see people most commonly reporting. So let's talk a little bit about how we utilize those fields. So for that, I'm going to go ahead and pop into the report analytics. Now you're going to notice within my report analytics, we have a bunch of templates here. If you haven't had an opportunity or if you're not aware, Verify does offer report templates available to download. So if you pop over to verify.com, you're going to notice in our knowledge base section or on our product downloads page, once you sign in, you'll have the ability to download all those report templates. The report templates are all basic general information that we hear from our customers and general reports on that you can utilize as templates and make some minor adjustments to meet your environment. So if you're looking for any additional information on our templates or you want to download those, go ahead, sign into verify.com, navigate over to our product downloads page, and you'll notice right here you can download all of our Cube templates, CDR templates, as well as UCCX templates. If you're looking for additional information on those, we've got a great webinar we did out there last week on how to utilize those templates. So we're going to pick on a couple of these templates today. So let's go ahead and pick on the first one. Let's go ahead and look at calls summarized by peer ID. So in this particular report, it's a pretty straightforward report. We're essentially looking at all calls with a peer ID. Pretty straightforward. There, no bells or whistles about how we're searching this information. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to summarize that information. We want to see a summary on how our peer IDs are being used. In other words, how is our routing and our routing tables being used? So I can just easily run this guy for the current day. And we're on our current day. I'm going to run that in HTML format. We're going to give this guy a run. So what this is going to do is this is a great report that you can just download and run that's going to show you how your peer IDs are being used throughout your organization right now. In other words, from a routing perspective, your peer IDs are controlling a lot of those route points and where those calls are coming in. So getting a good idea of where the bulk of those calls, or at least total volume, is being used is a great way to be able to see how your system is being utilized. So here we go, very simple report, just for a current day. Keep in mind, we are looking at all events. Remember, every Cisco call is multiple events. So if I look at my history search, a peer ID doesn't just get used once. In this particular call right here, it came in on peer ID 300 and went out peer ID 801. So if I take a look at my report right here, that call is going to count once for peer ID 300 and again for peer ID 801. Nice thing about that is now you're really starting to see how some of those peer IDs are being used. Now, if I want to, I can get very specific. If I want to say, hey, how many calls came in on peer ID 300, I could absolutely do that. From a reporting perspective, it's just a matter of filtering down your peer ID. And let's say, what do we pick on, 300 here. And remember, we can also use our H323 origin to isolate just the calls coming in on my peer ID 300. So now if I use my H323 call origin and I add answer, make sure we got to check mark this guy. Anybody unfamiliar with that guy? He's an important character in our reports, as he's going to say, I want to see the calls that just match this criteria. If I click search and view results, let's see, what did I do here? Answer, peer ID equals 300. Let me take a look at my report. I'm looking at October 27th. And let me go back to my original results. Maybe I had my peer ID wrong here. Oh, I used peer address. So you'll notice right there I used the wrong field. Let me redo that guy here. This is why we do it live. And we're going to use our H323 call origin here. And we'll go back to answer. And we've got our match all criteria checked. So now we're going to bring in all of the calls. And I could see 5,725 calls came in on my peer ID 300. Now we're going to continue to show both of the events because they are relevant to the detail. But right here, your summary is going to be just the calls that came into peer ID 300. Right? So that's a very simple report to run to get an idea of how your peer IDs are being utilized. So the next thing, let's take a look at another report. So rather than focusing on something simple, let's go ahead and maybe look at media address. So this is a canned report also. So let's say, for example, I want to see some capacity utilization. I could write capacity utilization at my entire cube and see from a cube perspective how many calls are taking place or how many events are taking place all at once. And that's important because you know your capacity at your cube. But maybe I want to see out of all of that information, how many did my, let's see, how many did my PSTN use? Or how many of those events are taking place from my MS Teams part of the network? So let's change this report the same way you would change a template to match your information. So I'm going to say starts with media address 14112. That means it's going to isolate just the calls going to my MS Teams environment. And I'm going to change the filter name here. And there we're going to go, template, media address. Get rid of the word template here. And I'm going to save that guy off. So now what I've done is essentially I've created a capacity utilization report that's going to focus solely on the calls going to my MS Teams network. Now, the nice thing about this is you're starting to be able to narrow down where your utilization is taking place. And right here, I can see I have 32 total calls, peak concurrent calls. The peak lasted about 18 seconds. On average, I have about 8 calls going on at once. And I'm only looking at the current day, so I have a minimal set of data. But nice thing about this is now I can see that total usage. And this doesn't have to be broken down to just one particular peer ID. I could break this down to different media addresses just by adding additional peer ID addresses in there, or remote media addresses. So let's say, for example, I want to look at 14112, but I also want to see, maybe my CCE in that same report. So what I can do is just add the media address for my CCE, generate that report, and it's going to go ahead and give me total capacity utilization for both of those media addresses. So there's a lot of ways to be able to break this down. And the purpose of this webinar is really to kind of just give you an idea of some of the things we're seeing, let you know that we have some help out there. So there are some templates that you have available, yet you can very easily just change media addresses and things like that to be able to pull up that information. And here you can see I don't have a whole lot for, let me see, let me make sure I brought up the right report. I did. I don't have a lot of additional for my MS Teams network, so I don't have too many changes on that report. But the idea here is just to give you a little bit of ammunition on the types of things you can search and how you can search them. So from an error message perspective, let's say I want to see, did I have any calls that had internal error messages? Let's find out. So I'm going to add this, and I can just say starts with capital X. Now, I'm just looking at the current day. Let's see if we had any call fails, and we did. So nice thing about that is when you are trying to pinpoint some calls that failed, right there, I'm able to get that internal error code. I can pop over to the Google and key that code in there, and right there I'm going to be able to join the pop into the Cisco community, see what other types of people are having those particular error messages, and do a little troubleshooting for reverse troubleshooting. Now, just quickly, one of the things you'll notice is I searched for anything with an error code, but you'll notice I have a bunch of calls right here that don't have error codes. Not exactly true. If I drop this guy down, you'll notice that the second leg actually has the error code. Because remember, we're sorting these by the date and time. We don't expand all of the rows because you could get 40 rows in one particular call. But you can go ahead and expand that, see what that error code is, and quickly search it. You'll be able to see the disconnect text. You're also going to be able to see that codec that is getting the error message. And something that I'll notice right off of the bat is common. So far, I noticed this internal error code. I noticed this particular codec right there. And so far, I could see my peer ID is 200, peer ID is 200. And I bet if I drop this guy down, I also have peer ID 200. I have the same internal error code, and I have the same codec. Right there, I'm going back to my cube. I'm going to take a look at how this peer ID is configured and what codecs are allowed within that peer ID. And I may have just solved my issue with 30 calls that have been dropping throughout my day. So I know we are just about out of time. I hope I was able to shed a little bit of light on how to use some of those fields and what some of these fields mean. Mike, do we have any questions today?
So yes, we have a couple of questions that came through. A couple of them I already answered, but it's good to cover them. So can you quickly explain the H323 and the column names in call history?
Sure. So the H323 is only in there as that's how Cisco sends it. If you're familiar with Verify, you know we don't like to manipulate data. So we don't change the values or the column names that come over from the iOS or from the Cisco or the voice gateways. So we just keep the column name the same. Why Cisco called it H323? Probably because it's been around since H323 gateways were the most common. Again, you can change that using our custom labels, but that's why you see H323 in there. It's not something we made up, and it's honestly, it's not something pertinent to the fact that it is an H323 gateway, because a lot of these aren't. It's really just a column naming convention that Cisco's pushing to us.
Perfect. Then, do we have Cube reporting templates available for download?
We do. Yeah, absolutely. So if you pop over to our website and you will need to log in. If you don't have your account number, feel free to reach out to your account manager. They'll be able to provide that. So log in. If you go to support and then downloads, you're going to notice right off on the right-hand side under our download section, you could download the templates. And those are essentially all the templates that I had shown. And if you want some information before downloading those, if you go to our knowledge base over here, you'll notice our Cube section, and we've got a Cisco reporting template section right here. These are going to give you a little bit of detail about those, and if you click into any of them, it's going to give you a little bit more detail about what things you could potentially change to get additional information, or also what things are required and need changes to better match your environment.
Perfect. All right, sir. Then we have one other question. It was asked twice. Can we apply a name or label to the peer ID?
We do not have a way of applying a name or a label to the peer ID, so something that would pop into detail. That's a great comment and a very good question. At this point, we do not have anything like that, but I will take a look in to see what's possible from that perspective. I know we can create some searches that we can name, but it's not something that would appear in the detail at the moment.
Okay, one final question just came in. What field in the detail columns, I'm assuming call history, is the H323 call origin?
What field in the detail column? So from a detail perspective, it is actually called H323 call origin. So if I do my show hide columns here, you can see that it is actually called H323 call origin in the detail field. And that's what you would filter on or search to isolate just kind of that inbound leg or just that outbound leg. So I hope I answered that correctly.
Okay, I think we're good. Any other last minute questions? I'm watching both the chat and the Q&A. Going once, going twice. Okay.
All
Well,
right,
yeah,
I'm
let
going to
me
go ahead
wrap
and
it up.
stop sharing. Let's make you the presenter here. You should be good.
Oh, I know we're running a little over here. All right. So we did Q&A. I think next is the quick before we get to the Amazon winner. Just want to announce Planet Verify. It's our new user community forum. You and other users can connect with peers and to other Verify users and to the SCs and the rest of the Verify employees. Expand your knowledge, collaborate on topics, discussions, and earn points and rewards. You can access it by going to planet.verify.com or verify.com/planet. You can log in using your verify.com login. All right. So the winner of today's Amazon gift card is John Wagner. Congratulations. We'll have your account manager reach out to you soon. And I want to wrap up by thanking everybody for attending today's webinar. We do live webinars every Wednesday at 11 Pacific time. Next week's webinar is going to be conducted by Matt and Jim. They'll go over change management, setup, and reporting. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. Thanks all.